Welcome, chemistry students. Today we're talking about observations and inferences. So when it comes to observations, observations are how we look at and measure things in science. And so this is a big key for science because pretty much every lab that we do, every activity that we do, we have to make these observations. And so with our observations, the big question is, what is an observation?
Well, observations are made in science by using some things. So first, I would say we use our senses. We can see, we can taste, we can smell, we can hear things. We also in science use a lot of measuring instruments. Some of them are very precise, in fact. And by doing so, we can increase the accuracy and the precision of those measurements. And then finally, it's important to note that observations are not, they are facts, they are not opinions. So it's what we know to be true, not what we think to be true.
And so kind of building off of this, we have two main types of observations. And so with our observations, the first type is our qualitative observations, which are just describing the qualities of something. So as Mr. Foster was saying, this is where we use our five senses to kind of look at different things, and we can record like color, smell, taste, those types of things. The other type of observation that we have is our quantitative observations. And these describe the quantities of something. And so let's kind of talk a little bit more about both of these types of observations.
Well, these are hard to measure qualitatively. There are things that there's subtle differences between them, and they describe the qualities of something. And as Mr. Galla mentioned, things like color, taste, sound, consistency, how it feels, it's not necessarily something measurable. Yeah, and there's just almost an unlimited amount of qualities you could give to things.
And so our other type of observations are the quantitative observations. Now, these are the ones that are expressed as numbers. So any of the observations that we make that have a numerical value associated with it are considered quantitative. Now, these are also the ones that are generally counted or measured. So some examples would be things like the amount of something. Like if you said that there were 10 apples, that's an amount. The temperature, the mass, or even the length or size of something. And so just like with our qualitative observations, as Mr. Foster said, there are also many more of our examples of quantitative observations. And so the big thing here with these quantitative observations is that they need some kind of measurement instrument, which we were kind of talking about earlier.
Now, what happens is after we have gathered that kind of those observations and that data, we can make inferences. And that means we're drawing a conclusion based on data and observation. And this is evidence. This is based on evidence and past experience combined together. So let's practice a couple and just to get the feel for this. There's an observation. I hear people screaming. Well, my inference based on my experiences in life and what I'm guessing, I would say in this case, maybe there's people watching a scary movie. Because I've noticed before when people watch scary movies, there's a lot of screaming. You can come up with other ones. You could say, oh, I know when I'm at an amusement park and there's a roller coaster, there's screaming. So those could be different inferences based on that same information. So you have to pull all of the data together to try and make the best inferences. Another one would be, I smell cotton candy, popcorn, and hamburgers Well, for me, my experience and my senses there tell me I might be at a baseball game. You mean when I was a little kid, that was my main reason for going, I think. So, um, so we can have another one. I see a lot of people. Well, I mean, how many different inferences could you pull for that? For me, some of the biggest crowds I've seen, I'm at a concert. People everywhere. I mean, pre-COVID, obviously, but I mean, a time when there's a lot of people together. That would be one inference that you could draw from that.
And so with these, as kind of Mr. Foster was saying, is that there are tons of inferences that you can actually draw from these observations. It really all comes down to, the information that you have and then what you have experienced in your life. And so let's look at some other kind of examples here. And so one observation that we can make is that, a plant is extremely wilted. Well, why is the plant extremely wilted? And we could say this is the plant is extremely wilted due to a lack of water. Then another example would be something like, well, the car stopped running. And the inference that we can make is describing why the car stopped running. And so we could say it was because it was out of gas. Now, the big thing here, as you guys are looking at observations versus inferences, is that observations, remember, are just stating the facts, where inferences take it a step further and they state the fact and they explain why that might be true. And so that's the big thing here. And for our last observation, we have the Bears are 5-2. Whoop, whoop. Mr. Foster, why do you think, or what inference can you make from this observation?
Well, you'd like to infer that's because we finally have a good quarterback. But time will tell.
And so that'll be our last one, or our last inference for this one. And so now let's look at some other examples here.
Here's a couple of coins. And then so we have to try to decide if these statements are observations or inferences. Are they fact-based or are they best guesses? So there's a face on one side of the coin. Well, I think it's pretty obvious here that we have looks like a face on that coin on the left. So this seems like an observation to me. The Latin word Dei means God. Probably, but that's an inference based on some other knowledge.
Yeah, that's entirely based on a lot of the currency that we kind of have around, the country.
There's another one. The coin was made by deeply religious people. Well, we don't know that. That's an inference. We might be guessing it because they put religious symbols in, perhaps, but we don't know that. It's an inference. The date 1722 is printed on one side of the coin. Yeah, it's up there at the top of that coin on the right. That's an observation. The coin was made in 1722. That's an inference. It's probably a good guess, but we don't know it. And lastly, the face on the coin is a representation of the nation's president. So that guy up there with the leaves around his head, that's an inference. We don't know that. We certainly don't know that.
And so now that we've looked at some kind of observations and inferences just about this coin, let's look at some other ones just based on this picture that we have. And so let's kind of decide, and we'll give you guys, a few minutes here to kind of go through, or not a few minutes, but a few moments to decide for each of them and claim it as an observation or an inference. So first up, we have the narrow windows were used as rifle slits. Now, I know the picture is actually a little cut off now that I see it, but this does say that this is the Victorian Gardens near the Citadel on Alcatraz Island. And this is in 1869. So think about maybe what you know about Alcatraz and, where this might be or what this might be considered. So take a second to think about it. Mr. Foster?
Well, hopefully you decided this was an inference. We don't know for sure that those are used as rifle slits. There could be other explanations for it. So that's definitely an inference. So the next one is there was a garden located outside the Citadel. Well, when we look around, we see evidence of this, that there's rows and rows of flowers and plants and something that's a garden. So we're basing that on observation.
I agree. Definitely an observation. Now, how about our next one? Gardens were an important part of everyday life during the military years on Alcatraz Island. Now, think about it. Maybe decide for a second. And hopefully you agree that this ends up being an inference. Now, we don't necessarily know that gardens were an important part, but, it's a good hope that on a military island that they, take pride in their gardening and their green thumbs. Otherwise, our next one was people in the garden are mourning. So, Mr. Foster, what do you think about this one?
Well, I'm going to give our viewers a moment to think about it. So we have these people that are dressed, so it looks like sort of fancy clothes. Nonetheless, to me, this is an inference. We don't know that they're in mourning. There's nothing to show for sure why they're dressed or what their behavior is there. So that one to me is a pretty big stretch. That's an inference. Why don't you take this one? You guys think about this. Men were required to wear jackets and women were required to wear dresses.
So, as you guys are kind of thinking about it, here, hopefully, based on your knowledge of history, yes, a lot of like movies and TV shows, a lot of times show that men wore jackets, women wore dresses, especially during this time period, but that wasn't necessarily always the case, which makes this an inference. So men were not always required to wear jackets, women were not always required to wear dresses. And so with this kind of idea, let's look at our last two examples here. And our next one is the Citadel was made of brick. So let's give it a second, and then Mr. Foster will tell us what the answer is.
Well, if we look, you don't have to look that closely. I mean, that building is made out of brick. That's a brick wall. We know what that looks like. We're not having to guess, that the reason it was made of brick or, who made it. We're just looking at it and saying, yeah, that's brick. So this is an observation. There is a picket fence. So if you look at the picture, the statement is there is a picket fence. Mr. Gallo, what would you say?
Well, based on the picture here, there is definitely a picket fence shown. And so because that's a fact, that does in fact make this an observation. All right, well, that is it for today's video. And we'll kind of talk about observations and inferences a little more in detail.
Thanks for watching.